In early 2025, archaeologists announced the discovery of King Thutmose II's tomb. This was significant not just as the first discovery of a royal sepulchre in decades, but also the context of the tomb itself, its geographical location, its design and decoration, and the historical context in which the monument was constructed. King Thutmose II lived around 1500 BCE, and he is notable as the husband of the Queen Hatshepsut and the father of a boy who became the pharaoh Thutmose III. With that in mind, I thought it would be worthwhile speaking to an Egyptologist about this historical period and the larger context of these people. Fortunately, Professor Aidan Dodson of the University of Bristol recently published a book about Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, and Professor Dodson kindly joined the podcast to discuss these figures. What follows is a lengthy conversation about the new royal tomb and the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, and how, in many ways, their rule defined the new kingdom as we know it. It's a fascinating subject, so please enjoy this conversation. Good morning, Professor Dodson. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. How are you today?
Very well, very well.
You're speaking to us from Bristol in the UK, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you live there with your wife, Diane Hilton, who listeners will know as your co-author on The Complete Royal Families.
That's us, yes.
Yes, very good. And how are things going for you and your wife at the moment? What are you up to?
We seem to be chugging along quite nice. We've been doing quite a bit of travelling recently. We were out in Egypt in February, taking a couple of Egypt virgins with us, which was really quite fun to see Egypt through fresh eyes. You know, I've been travelling there for like 40 odd years, and therefore everywhere is, it's all fairly. I still get a buzz from some of these places, but I know them intimately. So it's really nice to have these people going, wow, it's a pyramid. And then we're in the Valley of the Kings. And one of the people was saying, wow, this is the best day ever, which she said virtually every day for the whole trip. So that was really quite something to say, see Egypt again from a newbie's point of view. And we've also been over to Spain and to Italy. So we're getting around a bit.
Excellent. That sounds like a very busy life at the moment. Dare I ask, did you have a chance when you were in Egypt to go anywhere near the new royal tomb of Thutmose?
Not at all, no. Although when we were out there the previous year, I was taking some telephoto views from Der Shelwet, the temple there, and as I turned out, I managed to get a perfect telephoto view of where the new tomb was found.
Splendid, excellent.
So that was I know it was just on spec. Oh, hang, we've got a view here. I've got a sort of quite a mega telephoto. So I've just done an article on the new tomb for Ancient Egypt magazine, which includes quite a nice photo of where it is from a distance, because I think all the photos which have been published have all been from close up, so people can't really get a full feel for where they are. So yes,
excellent.
So we didn't, we got to see it in the distance a year before they found it.
Wonderful. So today we're going to be talking about your newest work, which is Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, Pharaohs of Egypt, Their Lives and Afterlives. And this is the newest installation in a series you've been publishing since 2018, which is individual pharaohs or regimes and their long-term legacy, their monuments, sort of not so much in a narrative, but more in a sort of comprehensive thematic overview of different aspects of their reign. So I guess in the new book, you do touch on the tomb of Thutmose II, which I guess at the time you were finishing it up ready for publication would have been announced as this tomb has been found, but not so much on the confirmation side of things. So before we get into the new book, I do have to ask you about this new tomb, if you don't mind.
Yeah, what's interesting is that I can actually claim to have predicted where it was before they found it, because I did an article which came out because the tomb was actually found in 2022, and that same year I published an article in which I was discussing the orientations of various royal memorial temples during the New Kingdom, and had pointed out, first of all, that the axes of those of Amenhotep I, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose III all passed very close to their actual tombs. So I then said, well, what else have we got? Well, there's the Thutmose II temple down at Medinet Habu. What happens if we extend the axis of that? And it goes very close to what was then known, i.e., the tomb of Hatshepsut as queen. And actually, then when a couple of months later, Piers Litherland, before it was announced, he emailed me about it, and said where it is. I realised, that line is within certainly view what ancient surveying possibilities were. It actually goes through the tomb. So actually, I could actually say I had predicted its discovery, and also that I think also reinforces the idea that it was his. But of course, so the work which had revealed enough material to prove it was T2's tomb only came out after the book was published. So at least I was able to, I think, in the book, say pretty quickly, I'm happy that C4, which is what the tomb's known as, is his, and it also ties in with an evolving theory I've got regarding the relative orientation of royal tombs and memorial temples. So really, really interesting that it turned out to be where it ought to be according to that prediction. So yes, so that's sort of big handfuls about it. So I've got absolutely no doubt about its ownership.
Okay.
But I think it's quite, it's certainly fascinating the way that it does seem it had to be evacuated after only a few years because of flooding. And it shows quite interestingly the two-edged sword that those kinds of floods are, because down until we get to the reign of Thutmose IV, all these tombs are placed in what you might call waterfalls, or locations which are scoured by flash floods with the intention of hiding their location. But clearly here, with C4, they hadn't sealed it as well as they ought to have done, or there might well have been some kind of, which may yet turn up, some cracks in the rock which led to the flooding, which is what's happened much, much later in the tomb of Ramesses III, that the flooding of Ramesses III isn't through the entrance, it's through a crack in the ceiling. So it's possible that's what's happening on that one. Whether or not they're right about where the evacuation tomb is, and whether or not it might be intact, that's another debate altogether. But the fact that is the tomb intended for T2, which he occupied for, well, they're reckoning 6 years, seems fairly solid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that basically answers my first question as to whether you thought it was his originally intended tomb or something that had been adapted after his perhaps unexpected death.
No, I think, well, in a sense that a lot of tombs are adapted, but I think it must. But given that Hatshepsut's tomb is just round the corner, the so-called Neferu Re one, whether it is hers or not, that's another issue, is overlooking it. That's clearly the Thutmose II reign royal cemetery, is that chunk of the southwestern wadis. So there's no reason to not expect it to be his. And insofar as at that point they've got any kind of standardization of what a royal tomb looks like, the fact it's got a bent axis that parallels with the tomb, which is probably that of Amenhotep I up at Abu Naga. Sorry, and then the fact that the burial chamber is decorated with the Amduat and all that. So I think there's no question that's his original tomb, which then is evacuated. But where he goes after that is the next that's the next question. Which hopefully, I understand that work is underway, and we will confirm what's going out, and also that Piers is giving a number of lectures, including at the American Research Centre in Egypt, meeting next month in the US. So hopefully he may reveal more, or whether or not that's going to have to wait for next season, I don't know.
Fair enough. Fingers crossed that we have more information relatively soon. Touching on the cemetery's location, you mentioned that Amenhotep I, is at Dra Abu Naga, and then immediately after Thutmose II, we start to see very systematic burial patterns in the Valley of the Kings. The general public might be kind of surprised that why is this royal tomb out here in this side valley? shouldn't they be closer to the Nile or in the Valley of the Kings? Why is it here?
I think at this point they're trying things out. Bear in mind that Thebes had only been a royal centre since the 17th dynasty. The the place to be seen dead in, shall we say, had been Drablunaga, which is where you've got the 17th dynasty baby pyramids, the tomb of Amenhotep I as well. But probably there's a limit to what, if you're starting to look for more remote locations, at Drablunaga, the tomb of Amenhotep I is probably in the only location where you can put that kind of sort of hidden tomb. So
Mhm.
therefore, probably they're just trying. Okay, let's try this other remote location. Whether or not there is something to do with the location of close to Medinet Habu, which is of course the terminus for the Opet festival. So whether or not that they're trying that bit out, but then that's then used. But there's a limited number of areas in that area which you can then have. So then presumably then Hatshepsut or Thutmose III, because we don't really know where Thutmose the first original tomb actually is. All we can say is there is this tomb which he ends up in alongside Hatshepsut. So she then probably chooses the Valley of the Kings simply because it's behind the Deir el-Bahri temple.
Right.
So again, to maintain that connection. So I think that's an important point, is that up until this point, royal tombs had always been integrated. The temple, the tomb, and any kind of monument had all been coordinated.
Mm.
With the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom pyramids, you've got that very, very clearly. And even with Ahmose the first pyramid at Abydos, although it's atomized in the sense that the temple is there, the pyramid's there, the tomb is somewhere else, they are all clearly orientated together.
Mhm.
And the same goes when you're looking at the orientations of T2's temple and his tomb, T3 and A2 as well, after which it all falls apart. So the idea of Hatshepsut having her tomb sort of behind her temple works. So I think the Valley of the Kings is chosen almost because Hatshepsut has her temple at Deir el-Bahri.
Mm.
And then people then say, well, actually, then T3 says, well, actually, looking at a site for my temple, I can, you follow an axis of that comes into that same valley. So but bear in mind, he's got this unusual location very, very high up over there. So which may also be that there is, at least to a degree, almost a line of sight to his temple. So I think it starts that way, and then once you've got a number of kings having been buried in the valley, it then becomes the Valley of the Kings.
Mm.
It's that sort of. It's simply because because of Hatshepsut, where she had her temple, that starts the valley in use, and then it snowballs after that.
Right. That makes sense. So it starts out as just a valley, not necessarily any special association, but over time, the weight of legacy gives it its
Yeah.
own significance.
Yeah, and I think probably that people recognise well the stone's pretty good out there. There are a number of the locations which are chosen for 18th dynasty royal tombs with these waterfalls and stuff. And then so once you've got into the habit, and also by that time you've presumably also got a security mechanism. It's also handy if you've got your workmen over at Deir el-Medina, they can just hop over the hill to it. So I think it just then becomes the convenient place to do these things, even though it's no longer possible after A2's reign to actually build your memorial temple in a location which in any way coordinates with them. It just doesn't work topographically. But it is really noticeable if you look at T2, T3, Hatshepsut, and A2. The alignments are such that they can't be accidental. But when you get to T4, it's quite clear there's no site left on the front of the Theban necropolis, which will allow any without some extremely odd orientations for him to do that. So from that point onwards, the whole thing breaks down.
Right. Okay. Kind of dovetailing from that, that does bring us now to Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, the subject of the new book. Their tombs are relatively close together in the valley, high up. They're on the same general side and area. Thinking things through sort of chronologically or just logically, do you think Hatshepsut's tomb KV20 was started first, or would it be Thutmose III's that is started first?
The question there is, is whether KV-20 was begun by Hatshepsut or she took it over from Thutmose I, which I tend to think she probably did. And in fact, I strongly suspect that Thutmose I's memorial temple was supposed to be at Deir el-Bahari.
Right.
That the site, but then that gets taken over or even demolished by Hatshepsut. So when I was talking about the orientations, I think it's actually T1's temple is oriented with KV-20.
Right.
Because they were both that was at Deir el-Bahari, and then when Hatshepsut builds the second phase, because there's two phases very clear with different orientations at Deir el-Bahari for her temple. That then she puts wants to say sorry for demolishing her dad's temple, puts a small chapel in her own one, and then builds a new one much closer to the cultivation as well for Thutmose I. So it depends on the view you take of who actually originally owns KV-20. If assuming that KV-20 is purely Hatshepsut, it would have been begun after Thutmose III, because it's pretty clear that the first thing any king does is founds his tomb. And of course, at that point, while she's a regent for Thutmose III during the first 7 years, she's got this perfectly good tomb out in the southwestern wadis down by Thutmose II's tomb. So if she begins it from after becoming king, it probably comes after. But on the other hand, other way. But in favour, I think, of it being T1's tomb is the fact that it's of an anomalous shape and size. You'd expect if they were being constructed simultaneously or sequentially, that KV-20 would be much more like that of Thutmose III. And one of the things which I've noted is that the proportions of the burial chamber of KV-20 are the same proportions as those of the tomb of Amenhotep I.
Right.
Which for me supports the fact that they are they have a relationship which may well be sequential in the. So I think what's happening is that the tomb of KV-20 is built for Thutmose I. Then, with probably an original memorial temple at Deir el-Bahari, later demolished. Then T2 moves to southwestern Wadis, and then when she becomes king, Hatshepsut takes over Deir el-Bahari, takes over her father's tomb, and so on. So in the interim, T3's KV-34 will have been begun to a plan which is actually quite similar to that of Amenhotep I as well. And there are some, and again, its bent shape has some similarities with that of T2 in the southwestern Wadis as well. So I think that's how I see the evolution currently working anyway.
Okay, that makes sense to me, at least. So from burials in the valley, we now move to the rule of the queen, Hatshepsut as co-regent and then pharaoh. So let's touch on that sort of regency period when Thutmose III ascends the throne as a child and Hatshepsut is the one actually leading the government. Bearing in mind that, hindsight is 2020 and that within about 7 years she does promote herself to king. Looking at the iconography and the texts of the early period of the regency, do you see any evidence that Hatshepsut always intended to take the kingship, or do you think this was something devised later?
I'm not sure she had thought about being king at that stage, but from the outset, she is more prominent than any regent really previously had been. We don't have a huge amount, although we're aware of a number of regencies earlier on, I guess in Pepi II, I guess in Merin Ray for Pepi II back in the Old Kingdom and so on. We don't really see that monumentally, whereas what we do have that during the regency. So I think initially she is just simply keen to be a more prominent regent than usual. I think probably the decision to become co-regent comes when it's getting close to the point where T3 is going to be of age, and there is this discussion: does she want to step back as a regent normally would do, or does she want to carry on? And that may have been, I think that's probably an incremental thing until possibly somebody said, well you could always become co-regent. There's no reason that there is a concept of having two kings at once, which has existed back in the Middle Kingdom. Why don't you do it? So possibly that, I think it may be an evolving thought, but the very fact that she is depicted on monuments, in regent mode in a way that previous regents hadn't been, certainly suggests that she was keen to be a hands-on ruler, whatever her formal status was.
Right, that makes sense. And when she makes that transition, you've in the book you sort of lay out three particular categories or components, I should say, for a royal succession, which for the audience, the first is physical descent from the deity through the human incarnation of their father. Second is the proclamation of that heir as the intended successor before the court and perhaps the gods. And then thirdly, the heir or successor burying their predecessor, analogous to what Horus did for Osiris.
Mm-hmm.
The classic source in the New Kingdom for many of these ideas are sort of crystallized by Hatshepsut in the divine birth texts at Deir el-Bahri, which are later picked up by Thutmose III and then Amenhotep III. My question here is, looking at these components in terms of the sources, the evidence, how well established could we say they are before Dynasty 18? What kind of evidence exists for these?
Right. There's not a huge amount of it. I think until only perhaps 10 years ago, we thought that the earliest example of the divine birth sequence was Hatshepsut, which then led to all sorts of people reckoning she might have invented it as a way. Then at Dashur, fragments of a similar sequence have been found for Senwosret III from the Middle Kingdom. It's only fragments, but the sequence is sufficiently well known that you can spot it from just a couple of segments. That must be that. So we know it goes back at least that far. And one suspects it probably went back a lot further. Our biggest problem is with preservation, that you highlighted there that we've got Hatshepsut's example of it, and then you've got Amenhotep III's example. But that's simply because the sorts of buildings the intermediate ones would have had are totally trashed. My suspicion is that probably every memorial temple going back somewhere into the Middle Kingdom probably had that sequence.
Okay.
But we can't prove it. But the very fact that suddenly we do know, going from Hatshepsut, we now jump back a number of centuries to Senwosret III. That does suggest it's something which is in there. So I think that all that Hatshepsut's done is simply taken what is the conventional thing and slotted herself into it, with crossing her fingers behind her back to point out that there is no way that T1 could have proclaimed her. Although whether she's actually thinking about, when T2 was proclaimed, and she would have been there as part of the ceremony. So I think she's not, I don't think she's completely fictional and making it as complete fiction, but she was probably at the ceremony, but it was actually talking about her brother rather than her. So that's my suspicion anyway. But I think what she's doing there is not to invent anything new. She is simply picking up what I suspect if we find more fragments, because the problem is all these memorial temples have been trashed, and it's only because of the very great care that the Met team at Senwosret III's complex have been working. They're going down to these individual fragments, so it was just Adela Oppenheim who spotted this, that's saying, "Ooh, that's a bit of a divine birth sequence," and so on. So I think she knows what the official narrative is of becoming king, so she simply slots herself into it, and hoping that nobody sort of points out too much the gaping hole in it. But I think she's just taking on what that, and I suspect we probably have found these sequences for others. We've got a sequence for Ramesses II later on, so I think they've all had it. It's just preservation means that we've only got these two properly preserved incarnations of it, Hatshepsut's and Amenhotep III's.
Okay. Building on from that, bearing in mind the state of preservation of the earlier records, is there any aspect of Hatshepsut's depiction of these components, the divine birth, the legitimation, that we can confidently say that were hers, that she had added or changed to the existing standard? Or
Don't think we can know because the previous one, the Senwosret III, is just too fragmentary. But pretty well, I think when you compare it with the Amenhotep III, it's a basically the same thing. So I think it's very much a cookie cutter kind of thing that you just turn a handle and produce another one. Just change the names between the various incarnations of it.
Okay, you just change the birth certificate and away you go.
Exactly. And then, of course, ultimately, this all then feeds through into the Memesi of the Greco-Roman period as well. Although this is the birth of the god in the temple, it's quite clear, I think, that the basic structure is lifted from what we now know Middle Kingdom originally, if not even earlier, concept of the birth of the divine being, shall we say?
Okay, well that sort of prompts a sort of a chicken and egg question, I guess, which is, would you think of the divine birth of the king motif arising from the divine birth of gods, or vice versa, or who knows?
Honestly, I, in the sense that we don't have births of gods in before the Greco-Roman period. But again, that's sort of still a question about the preservation of temples. But I think if there were Memesi or Memesi rooms in New Kingdom temples, we probably would have there would have been something surviving. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't. So I think it starts off as being of the king, and then that ultimately transmogrifies into the Memesi of the Greco-Roman period.
Fair enough. I like that word, transmogrifies. That's a good one. It reminds me of, I don't know if you ever read Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh yeah, yeah, yes, yes, yes,
He had
yes.
his transmogrifier where he could change into anything.
Oh yes, I'm a great, and my wife particularly has got a whole load of Calvin and Hobbes books. So yes, I've spent many happy hour reading those.
So you can almost imagine Hatshepsut hopping into a cardboard box and coming out saying, "I'm a god now."
Yes, absolutely. Or at least now I'm now a king anyway. Yes,
Fair point.
goes in as a queen, comes out as a king.
So let's move now to Hatshepsut's actual kingly regime, or co-regency regime, if you will. The most famous figure within her court is easily Senenmut, or Senmut, however you like to say it. The first and most basic question is, what is so unusual about this chap and his position? Why is he so well known?
Basically, because there's two things. At one level, simply the sheer number of statues of him. Just the most sort of gross thing. The sheer number. I don't think there's any other non-royal individual who's quite got as many statues, and more of them keep popping out of the woodwork as fragments are being found in museum storerooms and so on. But the other is the fact that he has these representations in various corners of the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. His burial chamber, although it was never actually used, is actually within the precincts of the temple, and he has a sarcophagus which basically was made as a his and hers sarcophagus with Hatshepsut herself. Right. So all these things are because one thing it's worth noting is that while stone sarcophagi are quite a common thing in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, during the New Kingdom, they're largely a royal special, or a couple of very, 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 very high. So having a stone sarcophagus is quite something. But secondly, the fact you've got your sarcophagus has been made as a twin of that of your female king does suggest something quite. And so it's interesting that colleagues over the years have always tiptoed around the idea that they were actually romantic partners. And I'm not quite sure why this is. It just seems to be that everybody, no matter how much evidence they put forward, but we can't prove it, so we won't sort of say it. Well, I think the sarcophagi has to prove it. You don't have a his and hers sarcophagi unless you are a couple, as far as I'm concerned. And the reason why the way he's, this sort of ambiguous way he's presented, I guess, because there is no precedent for a king's, I say a king's husband in the sense that because I'm trying to avoid the word queen for Hatshepsut once she's actually become pharaoh, because the title she's got is king with a feminine end. So I try and avoid that. So I think that's why he's there. He's never shown with any kind of other female partner either.
Mm.
And the fact that he's shown in this sort of rather sort of not hidden way exactly, but in this rather sort of ambiguous way, is simply because people didn't quite know what to do with him as far as categorization is concerned.
Mm.
And in fact, it's the same actually if you look at up until relatively recent times, female rulers in general. That it's not in England, it's not until you get to Mary the First that you actually have got a standalone, an actual queen regnant.
Mm.
But there's always the status of the partner is always slightly problematic, even in relatively modern times.
Mm.
And so back in ancient Egypt, where the idea of a female actual ruler, you've only got sort of 3 or 4 of them known from history. Their partner is, so I think that's I'm pretty certain they were actually a couple. It's just that because of there was just no way of talking about it. So simply all we see is these odd things about him, say appearing behind doorways at Deir el-Bahri, his burial chamber being just about inside the temple precinct, and having a sarcophagus made as a pair with that of Hatshepsut.
Mm.
So those are the sort of things which make him unusual, and I think also make it pretty transparent for me anyway what's going on. Now, interestingly, Campbell Price of Manchester Museum is doing a companion volume in the same series as Lives of Afterlives on Senenmut at this very moment.
Okay.
And we've had discussions on this. I don't think I'm not quite sure where he's finally coming down on that. I haven't seen the manuscript yet for it, because I'm the general editor of this series, which beyond stuff which I'm doing for myself. But yeah, it's even he's slightly nervous about it. I think I have to recognise I think everything to do with ancient Egyptian history, which he put out, is actually a working hypothesis fundamentally. And I don't think there's a problem with actually putting forward something of that kind of nature, provided you say, look, this is my working hypothesis on this. I think that's what the men did, rather than just sort of stay sitting on the fence or in the middle of the road where you like to be run over. I think at least, I think on something like this, you've got to have a view. Did they or didn't they? And I think they did.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Speculation is the way we put flesh on the bones of the evidence.
Yeah, and I think for speculation, provided you say it's a working hypothesis, that's one of my key things I'm talking to students and so on. Make clear, understand that it's fine to make a reconstruction of something, but just make sure you don't insist it's the truth.
Mm.
Just simply say, this is the working hypothesis, which I think ties together the data in the best way at the moment. Bearing in mind that this could then be completely dumped subsequently if a new piece of data comes along.
Fair enough. And that's a very good point to make, I think, for the general public, is that one of the key distinctions of a trained and practicing historian is that they are able to say, this is my hypothesis, but this is not necessarily the truth. This is just what the evidence tells me. Yeah.
And also you've got to try and avoid building more hypotheses on the back of hypotheses. Mm. So you come up with a sort of a neat working hypothesis, but you've got to be very careful not to then assume that's correct when you go to the next stage. I think that's the point that you've got to recognize that once you've got to that pace, going beyond that, you're getting into very, very dodgy territory, and you need to be very careful about what you say, particularly to the non-specialist audience anyway. Mm-hmm. For whom history is a thing. It's not something which is a movable feast. Whereby whole facts can cease to be facts overnight.
Fair enough. That sort of touches on, I guess, a question of perception, both modern and ancient, with regards to Hatshepsut and Senenmut, whether they were lovers or not. Obviously, we will never definitively know. But there is one graffito carved in a tomb not too far away from Hatshepsut's temple that seems to show a female ruler engaging sexually with a man.
Yes.
Do you think this graffito is intended by the artist to depict them, or perhaps a later ruler, say Thutmose III?
I don't know. The fact it's in the air, it's in Deir el-Bahri. I don't see why it shouldn't be. I'm sure that there was plenty of gossip
Hmm.
going on, and and there were people probably who disapproved. There are probably people who disapproved with the whole idea of a female pharaoh as well.
Hmm.
So somebody, and that's a typical kind of slander on somebody, um, is to to show them in a compromising position. So we can't really, as there's no. I think it's most likely it is probably them, but we say we can't go beyond that. I think
Mm.
it seems likely anyway.
Mm. It does seem like the artist engaged in a bit of plausible deniability by not adding any names to the
Oh,
paper.
absolutely. And I mean, you think about the graffiti people put on buildings today. It's no different really. Just this is probably slightly more skillful than some of the stuff you find on on the sides of buildings today. So I'm sure there were. I'm sure it was probably it was if it was even a secret at all. It was just one of those things which people knew about, and an idle moment, an artist decides to do something like that. Um,
Fair enough. Now, obviously, one of the reasons why perhaps historians are reticent to speculate on a lover relationship is that we don't tend to do the same thing with male rulers. Even though they have their principal wives, they almost certainly have their consorts or lovers, and there are stories like Neferkara and his
yeah.
general, so forth. But you've tiptoed around it here, but the most likely explanation is that we're unwilling to commit to that sort of speculation, partly because Hatshepsut is a woman, and we don't do the same thing with the men.
I think it's one of those typical bits of double standards. Yes.
Another
Um,
another aspect of that which has sort of affected earlier histories is the question of the public image of the pharaoh as a warrior. And older histories especially like to depict Hatshepsut essentially as a peaceful ruler rather than the leader of a militaristic empire. Is that accurate though? Is there any evidence for
not
her
in
regime
not at
undertaking?
all. We have actually got texts which make it quite clear that Hatshepsut was leading an army in Nubia, and it also implies that she's actually sort of on the battlefield picking over the booty from fallen enemies. So I think she's there's no that gets quite clear. It's in somebody's autobiographical text. There's no reason why that wouldn't be there. We've got scenes of her at Der el Bahri as a sphinx trampling on enemies, and it may and it wouldn't and the that we haven't got no smiting scenes for her, but I think that's probably a matter of preservation.
Right.
Given that an awful lot of her material was erased, in some cases, completely erased and the wall recarved. So I have no problem with that. And no, her father was was a warrior king. And if we look later in the dynasty, we see representations of Nefertiti smiting enemies. We've got images of Mutnezhmet and also Queen T as sphinxes, which is very much a violent, powerful incarnation. So I don't think it's an issue. I think this is all again. It's very much modern, modern sexist assumptions, as well as it makes a nicer story. Hey, you've got this peace-loving woman, and then then T3, who is the warrior. So it makes a nice story, but it doesn't sort of again, female rulers have always had an issue with that. There's Elizabeth the First sort of speech about the Armada and so on. But again, I don't think we've got necessarily any indication that that the ancient Egyptians would take the view that the woman is necessarily not going to be, isn't going to be so violent and whatever. So I think it's quite clear she's simply doing what a pharaoh does, in this case, leading an army into Nubia. Now, the fact that she's got a younger co-ruler probably means that I guess she's getting a bit older. She's probably happier to leave somebody else to to live in a tent in the middle of nowhere, so on. But I think they were on at least on this one occasion. She certainly was down. It wouldn't surprise if there weren't other occasions when she led the army as well. But it's just that Nubian campaign is the only one we've actually got the direct textual evidence for.
Right. Something that occurred to me as you were speaking, you mentioned the erasure of Hatshepsut's images which I guess are best preserved at Karnak. Something that sort of occurred to me is that things like smiting scenes and battle scenes, they tend to occur on the pylons and outer walls of a temple rather than the interior. You know, that
Yeah.
chaotic outer world should be outside. But it sort of suddenly occurred to me that one of the things we forget about Deir al-Bahari specifically is that what is currently preserved is the interior. We don't have the wall and the pylons, which should be in front of it.
Well, I think actually in Daryl Buffy you probably weren't. I think
Okay.
there's no archaeological evidence for there being pylons
Okay.
on that. I think it was a very the topography just didn't sort of work with, and I think also the architect is trying to also sort of mirror Montuhotep II's temple next door, which also doesn't have that.
Right.
So I don't think there's anybody has ever sort of detected anything to do with pylons, apart from potentially some mud brick ones somewhere. But no, but I don't do it all the work which has been done. I've never come across anybody suggesting that there were pylons there.
Okay.
Of course, at Karnak, Hatshepsut does, of course, build pylons, including the eighth pylon particularly, but that has been the entire decoration of that was removed under Amenhotep II and are completely redone from scratch. So that's probably where any smiting scene of Hatshepsut might have been, probably the eighth pylon, and also possibly also the fourth or fifth pylon potentially. But again, all those were completely completely stripped back to bare stone and redone. So yeah, it's. But I suspect the eighth pylon is the most likely place there was ever a smiting scene of Hatshepsut.
Mhm. Okay. The flip side of that is the diplomatic question, or diplomatic aspect, and this is not necessarily something specific to Hatshepsut as a person or a personality, but the Thutmosid court of this time seems to proliferate with images in tombs and iconography of foreign peoples coming to Egypt with their gifts and their embassies. You also highlight in the new book that a rather sizable proportion of the known and named courtiers or officials of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III as co-regents seem to be, at least a couple of generations back, Easterners or foreigners to some degree. Is this what's the question? Is this something that we should associate specifically with the co-regency of Thutmose and Hatshepsut, or is the early 18th dynasty court in general quite more cosmopolitan than people have talked
No.
about previously?
I think the problem is that we've got the best preserved examples of elite tombs really kicks in with Hatshepsut and T3 with the move to the Sheikh Abdel Kerner Hill. Previously, burials had often generally been up at Drabun Naga or even Wadi 300 in the south, which aren't as well preserved. So the proper prosopography of the Egyptian nobility. What we have massively increases at that point, partly because of the archaeological preservation. Now, I think what we're seeing there is a follow-on from an increasingly cosmopolitan Egypt, which probably kicks off under Amenhotep I. Well, probably, I suspect that once the Hyksos wars are over, we're getting people wanting to come into Egypt, those to make their fortunes and so on. And I think particularly once you've got Thutmose I with the conquest right up to the Euphrates. So I think it just means that you've suddenly got Egypt is now a much wider thing, and that people are within the. I always get comfortable with the word empire because it's more sort of a sphere of influence a lot of the time rather than sort of an empire in the structured sense we think of with the Roman or the British empires. That people are now starting to move into Egypt. Some of them are settling, and then that carries on really throughout the New Kingdom, and also I think also the world of the late Bronze Age is sort of settling down in a way, so that there's a lot more interchange. I think so the hostility, a lot of wars and so on, which seem to have characterized the Middle Bronze Age, are over. The Late Bronze Age settles down, and the sort of world which we later see in the Amarna letters which, although there is fighting going on, is broadly a sort of concert of nations, to use the sort of old the term which we had after the 19th century in Europe. People are moving round, and therefore people with foreign backgrounds will sort of merge into the whole thing. Because I think the Egyptian point of view, it seems to be that if you acted like an Egyptian, you were an Egyptian, no matter if your father came from Syria or whatever like that. So I think that's what's going on here. It's part of an increasingly cosmopolitan world. The stuff from the representation of stuff from Crete and so on. Well, probably now trade around the Eastern Mediterranean has got itself settled down, and all this all these things are a manifestation of that. It's a more cosmopolitan, interlinked world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sort of leading on from that, not in an immediately apparent way, but in that sort of universalist concept. Prior to becoming regent and co-regent later, during her queenly phase, Hatshepsut had been married to one of the so-called universal deities, which is Amun. She had the title God's wife, which in the book you highlight we assume is supposed to be appended with of Amun, even if she doesn't specifically use the god's name. Many of her court officials also have roles in the temple administration and economy. And the reason I highlight this is that previously authors like J.J. Shirley, for example, have emphasized the role of the Amun priesthood in Hatshepsut's regime. And I suspect this is often part of a sort of broader historiographical trend of presaging or predicting the Amarna turbulence. My question to you, and this might be a little bit complicated, but my question to you, and this might get a little bit complicated, but bear with me, is what is your view of the relationship between the pharaonic state and the temple church, if you will, at this particular period? Is it right to view the priesthood as power brokers in Hatshepsut's regime, or should we view her regime as co-opting the temple hierarchy for her benefit?
Well, I think we need to sort of slightly unpack the whole question about this idea of church and state, because this is fundamentally something from French historiography of the 19th century, or European historiography, where the history of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire is much of it is punctuated by the church and the state, the conflicts between the popes and emperors, popes and kings, all those sort of things, all of which I think led to people who sort of founded the writing of Egyptian history with the view there is this thing about church and state. And we still talk about church and state today, of course, separation of state, all those kinds of things. I'm not convinced that the actual dichotomy even existed in ancient Egypt, because the idea of there being religion and non-religion being different things, I don't think is something which would cross an Egyptian's mind, because the king is a god, or we can have a long debate of what sort of god, but the king is a divine being. He is the one who provides endowments to temples. In temples, he is shown as the officiant, although in practice it's being delegated to a high priest or whatever. So the idea that there is the king on one side and the priests and the temple, I just don't think is actually a thing at all. I think they're just different sides of the whole. Clearly there is when you're looking at how Egypt is run, there's a division between, you might call, the civil power, in the sense of the vizier and all the various overseers of the granaries who are doing that kind of stuff. But then the various temples are simply the bit which deals with the gods, if you know what I mean. So there's half of his people is people dealing with the actual population of Egypt, granaries, all those kind of things. The other side is the people who are the ones who are carrying out the cults for the gods. So I don't think, although it's an important economic building block, I don't see it as something different from the rest. And I think if you look at the titles held by a lot of senior officials, they're both people who are working in the in the civil domain, but or in the army, but also they might be a high priest of somebody as well, or whatever. So I just don't see that. I can see that there is clearly going to be power dynamics involved, but I don't see it's a clear cut thing whereby the Hatshepsut is leaning on the Ammon priesthood. That implies the Ammon priesthood is something which has some kind of separate entity, other than the fact, but actually it's quite clear the Ammon priesthood is headed by the king.
Mm.
So I think that whole thing is something which we've got to be very, very careful about. And when we talk about decolonizing Egyptology, one of the key things is to try and pick out what bits of the historiography are not genuinely based on anything to do with ancient Egypt, but just simply certain assumptions about the way that history works, which have been derived from from European prototypes, and bearing in mind that the people who are writing the original texts of Egyptian history are people who are steeped in that kind of view of how history works. So clearly the temples have an important thing, but the idea that they are a separate power base, separate from the king, for me is a bit of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And again, looking at modern historiography, that was the whole point about Henry VIII, that he wanted to make sure that there was no second way in. So he can control both the church and the state.
Mm-hmm.
There was no need to have that kind of sort of revolution in the case of Egypt, because the king was church and state already. So I think that there's a fundamental, I think I have a fundamental disagreement with many colleagues' conventional narrative. And when we move on to the Amarna period, the idea that Akhenaten is trying to, again, break priestly power, I think is complete rubbish. We're not talking about Akhenaten today, but I just think he was a religious maniac who wanted to change the world. That's there was no kind of sort of political subtlety. He just had a dream,
so to speak. So we shouldn't imagine Hatshepsut's relationship with the priesthood as being anything, like a sort of Thomas Becket situation, rid me of these troublesome priests or anything like that.
No, because the one part of that Becket was he'd been appointed by the Pope, so therefore he had a separate power. In the case of all the priesthood of Egypt, they're all answering directly to the king. So, clearly there may be personality issues where various priests want more power, but ultimately, that's the chain of command is directly from the king. Why should the king be trying to sort of negotiate with people who work for her?
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. So Hatshepsut was a successful ruler, a creditable entry in the long lineage of kings. But she did not live forever, and in the reign of her nephew, Thutmose III, that legacy was complicated by political and other concerns. Professor Dodson lifts the curtain on some of these questions. It is a fascinating part of the story. So Hatshepsut dies around year 22 approximately. Keeping on that sort of administrative question, what kind of continuity or change do we see with the I say incoming, but the sort of the newly independent Thutmose III regime? Does he make any obvious changes to the court that was left over by her?
Not that we can see. It seems pretty well that at least for the first couple of decades, there isn't. We of course do see later on certain people who'd worked during the co-regency period being disgraced, but that I suspect is possibly in some ways tied in with the later disgrace of Hatshepsut. But that takes 20 years later. So I think some of those kinds of things were probably retrospective, like 2 decades later, when people are perhaps already dead. As far as we can see, everything just chugs on administratively throughout on from there, and with changes of office bearer simply when a person has died or retired or whatever. We don't see. I think there's no obvious cliff edge as far as the administration of Egypt is concerned.
Okay, and So let's talk about that erasure that seems to come along about 20 years later. The first sort of historiographical question for those who may not be familiar is how do we know it is happening 20 years later or so? What gives that away?
Basically, it's when you start looking at the phasing of the building and work at Karnak. What you find is sort of in front of erased things, where things have been moved, and stuff like that. It was this was all done by initially by Charles Nims back in the 1950s when he started looking very carefully and suddenly realizing that it's quite impossible for certain erasures to have happened until after something else had happened. And in big handfuls, it's around sort of after year 42 is really when we can start saying, yeah, this is when things are being done. Um, and then that carries on as far as we can see until into the end of the reign. So, and that was always, that's always, ever since that discovery has been made, it makes it quite difficult to understand quite what's going on. You know,
Mm,
the old narrative popularized by Winlock and people like that, that 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 T3 had been champing at the bit, and the moment his Hatshepsut was dead, he sort of took revenge and whatever. But there's no indication of that whatsoever. Um, Also, some of the work which was being carried out at Hatshepsut's death is carried on in T3's name without any sign of anything being erased or anything. He's, as any other king, once his predecessor is dead, just carries on the work. And then we have this, like 20 years later, suddenly this all happens.
mm,
And a suggestion has been that it wasn't so much Thutmose III who was sort of behind all this, but it was his son Amenhotep II. Um, the idea being that because his successor is born late in life, because he's only Amenhotep II is only 18 when his father dies, and it's A2 who has, for his own reasons, problems with his father ever having shared the throne with a woman, or
mm,
whether it's particularly Hatshepsut. It's always assumption it's something to do with her having been a woman, but we're not absolutely sure about that. And Hatshepsut will have died before A2 has been born. So there's sort of stuff around that which just suggests that might be it. But that's again purely a working hypothesis that it's something to do with that. Because that's always one's always catching at straws as to why suddenly something will happen after a 20-year
mm,
hiatus like that. So I think that's all we can really say. And it actually is not carried through totally comprehensively
mm,
because okay, there's the destruction of three-dimensional images that's done pretty comprehensively, the sort of smashing of statues. Then you're getting some wall decorations are recut as Thutmose the first and second, very very rarely Thutmose the third, but there's whole swathes of surface which are cut back a bit. Hatshepsut's figures removed, but not invisibly. There's still the outlines. Everything is still, and everything else is still there. And then so it all seems to fizzle out to some degree. That the whatever lay behind it, whether that's at Thutmose the third's death or what, again, not really quite sure.
mm,
So the whole thing is somewhat mysterious.
mm.
Um,
If I could
so
ask you to speculate wildly, do you have any sort of gut instinct on whether it was
not
T3 or A2?
Not really. The trouble is, well, we're now in a position where there's no data.
Mm,
That the only sort of reason for thinking it might be A2 is it's sort of all happening when he's probably becoming crown prince.
right.
But but quite honestly, it's
Mm,
we're into territory where it's not so much working hypothesis, it's just wild guessing.
mm,
And I think that's all we can just simply say. That's what happened.
mm,
For some reason, the memory of Hatshepsut got cancelled.
mm,
But what's interesting though is that this cancellation is rather half-hearted, and then because we see sort of a couple of centuries later in 21st dynasty, the priest king Pinagem I naming one of his children after Hatshepsut, another one after Thutmose III.
Mm.
There's his daughter Mat-Kare, which is the prenomen of Hatshepsut. His son is Menkaure, who is the. Neither of those names had been used in the interim. So clearly, whatever was going on, the general sort of popular memory of this period is that you've got a great female king, a great male king, and that there's, and Pinagem is later on happily calling his children, I don't know, effectively Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. So that attempt to cancel her is clearly not particularly successful.
Mm.
And the existence of a female pharaoh in the early 18th dynasty is there in Manetho. So yeah, it's interesting how far some of these sort of cancellations, how effective they actually are in practice.
Okay, which that prompts two thoughts on my part, that when we talk about Karnak and even Der al-Bahari to a certain extent, it's always important for us to remember that 99% of the population are never gaining access to the interior sections of these temple precincts. So they're never seeing the erasures that are happening to Hatshepsut. That's designed for a very specific human and divine audience when that is happening. So unless we find a text that's a proclamation that nobody should speak about Hatshepsut, there's really no way to say how much of this is happening in that tiny top band of society and how much it's actually imposed or enforced outside of that community. And the other question has suddenly vanished from my mind, so I'll forget about that, unfortunately. But that sort of now brings me to... Oh, no, sorry, there we go. Got it. One of the speculative possibilities about this, because you have written previously a quite thorough and influential article about the princes and the problem of their evidence or lack thereof in many cases. One of the suggestions that has been put forth is that because Hatshepsut and Thutmose ultimately come from collateral branches of the same family, which sort of splits at a certain generation through different mothers, is it possible that there was another side to the Thutmosid royal family that Amenhotep II was trying to outmaneuver?
Again, I think we're talking about. There is no evidence that that kind of thing was a thing in Egypt. And I think that's sort of modern historians speculating, particularly based on some of the squabbling in European royal families. I don't think there is here. And as far as Amenhotep II is concerned, his mother is a commoner, so I think he's sort of not really in that at all. And again, this is all going back to these old ideas of heiress queens and heiress princesses in many ways. The fact that who your mother was actually is an important aspect of it, whereas we have no indication that is indeed the case. So for people who aren't sort of fully familiar, that the idea that the 19th century idea was that the right to rule was passed down the female line rather than the male line, and that therefore the legitimacy or otherwise of a given king depended on who their mother was and whether they were the heiress princess. Well, there is no evidence for the concept of heiress princess at all in ancient Egypt. And I think that was just simply dredged up by 19th century historians as a way of trying to explain why you get brother sister marriages.
Right.
And again, contrary to what's generally seen as an incest taboo in human society. So that's sort of something, again, made up completely. There is no evidence for that. And why there would be some kind of issue here. So because Amenhotep II is his mother's a commoner, why he would have any interest in all this at all. So I think it's not a thing. And also, I think it's quite clear that the whole idea of heiress of any kind of thing like is shown to be completely pointless by the whole divine birth idea, which makes it quite clear. Although you're the son of, okay, you're the offspring of a moon, but Ammon has taken the form of your human father for the moment of conception. So it makes quite clear that what matters is who your dad was, who your mother was, is completely irrelevant. So I think it's a red herring, which again has been created by modern, the 19th century historiography. And the trouble is that once one of these things is sort of there, it's difficult sometimes to shake off. It's what I call a zombie fact, something which was a reasonable working hypothesis a century ago, really has now been shown to have there's no basis for it, yet because it's there, it's something which Maspero said, or it sort of keeps on sort of coming back. And even people who walked, and I think people aren't, the reason why I'm quite keen to include so much of the historiography in these books is to make it clear to people where this stuff comes from. Because just talking to somebody, when you're an Egyptology student today, there's stuff which you get told this is how it is, without actually realizing this was something which Champollion had a wild guess about 200 years ago, and we still, and we still run with it. So I think it's quite. So sometimes they say, look, actually, no, it's an idea, but it simply hasn't got any data which would support it. So therefore, it seems rather that there's just sort of there's no point in arguing about it, because you've got no data to support it, and all I can say is you've got no data to support it. It may be, if it's a nice story, all very well, but actually, if it's not based on any real data, what's the point?
Fair enough. That brings us to a question which you also discuss in the book, related to data and questionable interpretations, and that is the human body or mummy that is purported to belong to Hatshepsut. It now lies in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in a nice glass case with a sort of brass or golden placard that proclaims it to be Hatshepsut. You discuss the identification of this body that was discovered in tomb KV60 in 1903, and that in the early 2000s was claimed on certain criteria to be that of Hatshepsut. The first question is, what was the primary basis for that identification? And the second question is, do you agree?
Okay. The story of identifying with Hatshepsut actually goes back to 1966, when Elizabeth Thomas published her book on the Royal Necropolis of Thebes. And she, as a passing comment, when she says, well, we don't know what happened to Hatshepsut's mummy, but there, just outside her tomb in KV60, were found two female mummies. One is the nurse of Hatshepsut, and this one, which at that stage was unidentified. Might they have cached Hatshepsut there? Question mark, full stop. End of story. Then the tomb was rediscovered or re-excavated by Don Ryan 20, 30 years ago. I can't remember exactly what the date is now. And he happened to mention Thomas's suggestion, which was initially vehemently denied by Zahoas, who then had second thoughts and wondered whether it might be true or not. At this point, a box which had been found in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri was brought into the whole thing, and this was given a CAT scan. It was basically, all they could see was there was this human organ of some description had been stuffed into a little wooden box, probably a little jewel box, but looking at the size, the sort of size of, at least a trinket box of some description with Hatshepsut's name on it. And when the box was CAT scanned, it was found there was a tooth in the bottom of it. At this point, there was a sort of what I call the Cinderella theory comes in, is that, could this be the tooth of Hatshepsut? And then the mummy in question is CAT scanned, and it's found it's got a tooth missing, and the CAT scan of the tooth is compared with the CAT scan of the cavity, and hey presto, it fits. And from that point onwards, it's Hatshepsut's mummy. Unfortunately, there's a couple of little issues here. First of all, there's the chain of logic. Why would one of Hatshepsut's teeth be in a jewel box stuffed underneath what's clearly a later edition of a mummified organ? It's like saying I've got a biscuit tin from King Charles's coronation. I find a tooth in it. Hey, it's King Charles III's tooth. So there is this whole. First of all, there's this logic. It's a tooth in a box, and also it's in the royal cache. don't think Hatshepsut's mum is in the royal cache, although there are a couple of mummies which have never been examined from the royal cache, which is possible. Also, however, there in the royal cache is the mummy of Mat-Kare, the 21st dynasty princess who's named after Hatshepsut. So this could be a box belonging to her, might be a tooth. No point then is did anybody check where there was a tooth missing from Mat-Kare's mouth in all this. Then, however, people have then, various dental people have looked at this and said, actually, this tooth doesn't actually fit where that, in this cavity anyway. It's the wrong tooth.
Right. Like
And
it's
then,
like it's
well,
not a molar, or it's the wrong
it's
actual
the
type of
wrong.
tooth.
It's various people say, no, this cannot be the right tooth. It just doesn't fit. And then a further thing was when finally some of the material from KV-60 was cleaned by Don Ryan's team, which included a second coffin, because there was one coffin which had got Hatshepsut's nurse in it, and the other coffin had been broken up by robbers. But this was then cleaned, and the name of a singer of a moon was found on that coffin. So you've got two coffins, two mummies. One's a nurse, one's a singer. It rather suggests that the mummy is that singer.
Fair enough.
So, therefore, my view is that mummy is the singer. I can't remember what her name is off the top of my head, but that mummy, which is now in the Nemek, is actually this singer of a moon, who presumably was a singer at Hatshepsut's court or something. But I cannot see any way that mummy could be the mummy of Hatshepsut.
Fair enough. And I suppose, given what we know about the caching and reburial of royal mummies, if this coffin did hold actual Hatshepsut, we should expect at least fragments of her name and a burial text on the coffin.
Yeah, and also bearing in mind what we know about the caching is that it's all done in a fairly sort of formal kind of manner, and that it's, if her mummy was moved, it would have been moved to one of the other locations. Now, it's worthwhile pointing out that it's possible her mummy may have been destroyed by robbers. It's also possible, we don't know when the flooding took place. So it's possible that the of KV-20. So it may be that her mummy may have been recovered by the officials in a fairly horrible state. And I say there are a couple of mummies which are listed by Maspero back in the 1880s as found in the royal cache, which have never been examined, and I'm not sure necessarily whether they're currently identifiable in any of the in Cairo either. So it's not impossible that her mummy did end up. And we actually do know that the burial commissioners did have her in their hands at one point, because a fragment of her coffin was found in the tomb of Ramesses XI, which was being used as a workshop when they're stripping things. So rather the burial commissioners clearly were in KV-20. They had got her coffin out, or bits of it out, but quite then what state her mummy was in may have been completely trashed by robbers already, and therefore wasn't up to rewrapping. We just don't know. But I cannot see any possibility of the KV-60 body being Hatshepsut.
Fair enough. That's very thorough. Thank you. My final question is about the sort of what we might call the afterlives in a political historical sense, which is Thutmose III and Hatshepsut don't have quite the same public cache as someone like Tutankhamun or Ramesses II, who are household names known the world over. Among ancient history enthusiasts, they are quite popular. For the ancient Egyptians in a practical sense, and leaving aside the erasure of Hatshepsut from the official monuments, what was her actual de facto practical legacy for subsequent generations? What were the lasting political or social changes that resulted from her reign, in your assessment?
I think you have to bring T3 in at the same time. I think the two, but the point is that their regime, which lasts 50 years, if you take it over 50 years, is a point really where New Kingdom Egypt defines itself. If you look at artistically, conceptually, and a whole range of other things, if you look at the art of the early 18th dynasty, it's clearly just simply following on from the Middle Kingdom. Under the Thutmosids, possibly no, we haven't got a huge amount from T1, but from that point onwards, we're starting to get a much more defined, recognisable middle of 18th dynasty artistic style, which in many ways then becomes almost the classical style of Egyptian art. You're still finding things which have a lot of, in the third intermediate period, they're sort of following some of those kinds of things. And I think the very fact that between them, they're responsible for a large chunk of Karnak, which again defines what an Egyptian temple, a New Kingdom temple is. And it probably is a sort of different thing from temples of the earlier periods, again, have a huge amount of material. But again, I think it defines all that. Then it's them who really consolidate. I don't like the word Egyptian empire per se, but the Egyptian control over large chunks of Syria, Palestine, the control of Nubia. So I think that they lay the foundation. They basically define what New Kingdom Egypt is, and that is, that continues on. And then when you're looking at, say, later, they're still remembered together in the 21st dynasty, a number of centuries further on. Thutmose III's name is very amuletic. I was recently looking at a collection of scarabs in a local museum here, and the number of them which actually have Thutmose III's name is remarkable. It's the most sort of common royal name on scarabs, other than things which are clearly contemporary, if you know what I mean. So if anybody's making something, that's an amuletic name going forward.
So these were later scarabs from subsequent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that's what it is. It's they define what New Kingdom Egypt is. I think is the best. It's a shorthand way of putting it.
Very good. That's quite an illustrious legacy, and that brings me to the end of my sort of formal questions. So if you have a couple minutes, I'd like to just ask you some sort of lighter questions, just about.
Feel free. Yes, certainly.
So the first one, generally, what are you currently reading or listening or watching at the moment that you're especially fond of?
Oh dear, what am I doing? At the moment, what am I doing? There's a couple of British bands recently coming out to the Last Dinner Party and English Teacher. I don't know whether you were aware of either of those.
I'm not, but I will look them up.
Yeah, no, I have to say my musical taste is still sort of, as people generally are sort of rooted in the 70s and in their youth, so 70s and 80s, and there are a couple of bands which are doing sort of some really quite interesting stuff, which is reminiscent of that. Another band which I've got heavily into is Måneskin. Italian rock band who won the Eurovision Song Contest in a most non Eurovision way, and they're picking up roots from 70s music and then sort of replanting it in a more modern kind of way. So musically, I'm very much in that sort of thing. Reading wise, I continually reread Terry Pratchett.
Very good choice. Excellent.
And I noticed recently that one of Pratchett's novels is being republished in an annotated version in a modern classics series. So it looks as though Pratchett is soon going to be taught in schools by the looks of things. So, which is
I'm sure that's overdue for many of his fans. He should have been taught in schools decades ago, right?
Absolutely, but it's the other thing that I think for an author, sort of, there needs to be sort of a bit of a decade or two sort of time lag before that. So that's sort of that area. Otherwise, most of my time, we do a lot of travelling. My wife and I are quite inveterate travellers, but also I've currently got 5 books which I'm working on at the moment.
That was going to be my next question: is what are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, well, they're split into two sort of categories really. There's Egyptological stuff. There's in production at the moment is the next one of my Lives and Afterlives series, which is the Libyan pharaohs.
Okay.
Which should be out at the back end of the year, hopefully. And also I've got 2 more of that, which I'm signed up, which I'm starting to work on. One is on Amenhotep, son of Harpu.
Okay, excellent.
and one on Amenhotep III. The two of those should sort of really be sort of work in parallel, as they're both sort of that kind of thing. I've also got a book which hopefully will be going to the publisher in the summer on basically a mad Scottish duke who was buried in an Egyptian sarcophagus.
Interesting. Who's that? What's his name?
The 10th Duke of Hamilton, just outside Glasgow, and he was buried in a Ptolemaic sarcophagus. He also owned the sarcophagus of Pabassa, 26th Dynasty one. So the book is a mixture of the formal publication of these two sarcophagi, texts, all that kind of stuff, but also telling the story about the Duke himself, how he acquired these, and all the stuff around that. So hopefully that's going to be finished in the summer. Hopefully, I've been signed up to write a complete history of ancient Egypt for an American university press, which I've got to have written by 2027. It'll probably come out in 2028. And also, in addition to my Egyptological work, I'm also a naval historian. I work on modern naval history, and I've written 5 books on. When I say modern, I base my interests are from about 1850 through to about 1950, and I've just published a recent one on a class of British cruisers built during the First World War, and I'm working on another one which completes the story of British cruiser building during the First World War. So that's sort of keeping me quite busy.
I think listening to that, I think any listener is going to have the question is, how do you find the time and energy to be covering this many things at once?
Well, I like to have a lot of things on the go. But the thing was that for 25 years, I had to split my academic career from also a day job. Like a lot of academic jobs aren't to be had. And for 25 years, I was a part-time civil servant and part-time academic. And that meant to be able to do my academic work and have a full-time day job, I had to be very, very disciplined about getting stuff done. And in fact, I think I managed to. Most people didn't actually realise I was only a part-time academic, but I managed to keep stuff going. But
I
then
had no idea.
but then I managed to get early retirement. The last time the British government was trying to do a massive cut of the civil service, there were some very attractive redundancy packages available, which meant I left on pension at the age of 50, which was rather
Very
nice.
good. Okay.
Which then allowed me. It was suddenly so all this chunk of my time, which had previously been day job, suddenly became available for work. And effectively, this is when I started doing naval history in a much more it's always been one of my interests. I'd written about naval history back when I was a teenager, but I was better to bring that in. And also it allowed me then to actually have a number of different Egyptian projects on the go at once, all of which are phased, so they're not all due at the same time. Basically, I'm due to deliver something roughly every 12 months. So it means I can sort of veer and haul between these things. So if I get fed up with one project, I can switch to the other one, rather than being in a situation where you've just got this one big thing, you're fed up with it. But whereas and I've just spent a few days doing some stuff on the Old Kingdom for the big history book, but I've put that down now, and I'm back to what's going on in the 1920s with this particular group of cruisers. And I'm just waiting on somebody who's producing a section for the Duke of Hamilton book. Once she's delivered that, I can then do the final topping and tailing of that and get rid of that. And
You mean like a visual section of it?
No, she's talking about the demolition of the Hamilton Palace, which she's done some research on. So the book is actually a bit of a. They're a bit. I'm the overall author, but there are various sections we've written by different people who can sort of bring a different, like the textual commentary for the sarcophagus which the Duke's buried in. It's been done by a colleague at Chicago, because it's corrupt Book of the Dead texts, and I don't do corrupt Book of the Dead texts. There are things I do, but she does corrupt Book of the Dead text. So she said, she was very happy to do that. So therefore, it's sort of that's. But anyway, so once that's together, that can be done, and then I've got a meeting with the guy. I'm actually co-writing the book on Amenhotep, son of Harpu. So I've got a meeting with him in the summer, that my co-author on that, to see where we're going. So it means I can just veer and haul about what I do, and it's just also just making a use of time. If I'm on a train for an hour or for a couple of hours, I can do it writing on a plane, and although it's just not having a time when I could otherwise just looking out the window, I might as well do something, and that's something. That's how I make it work anyway.
Very good. And that's certainly impressive and a sensible way to work. I wish I could do that more with this podcast, but I do have my narrative. Final question, and this is sort of a very general question that I've asked variations of over the years, but at the moment the current incarnation is, if you could, leaving aside language barriers, hang out for a day with an Egyptian of the New Kingdom, anyone at all, preferably non-royal, but not exclusively, who would you like to spend the day with, and what would you like to...
I think at the moment, Amenhotep, son of Harpu.
I had a feeling.
Because if you'd asked me this question before I started writing the book on him, I probably may have said somebody different. But just what is it about you which made you this thing? How what actually was your role? You seem to have been sort of Lord High Everything, the guy behind everything which was going on. How did you do it? What were you up to? I think that would have been my. He's somebody I would really have liked to sort of have dinner with. Although I say not with non-royal, I still would like to have dinner with Thutmose III, because I think he's everything we can see about him. He seems to be a very interesting kind of person. The very fact he has the botanic garden reliefs. No other king who's conquering king also brings back plant samples and things like that. So he's sort of somebody I would, and somebody I wouldn't is probably either Amenhotep II or Ramesses II, who I think would be what I think the Americans call jocks.
Okay.
I think they are the sort of people who are just going to boast about how fit they are, how many women they've slept with. Whereas I get the feeling that T3 would have been a much more sort of, although a warrior king, somebody who's got a much more more sort of texture and subtlety to that. So those are I think probably the two of Amenhotep, son of Harpu, and T3. I think would make a wonderful dinner party.
Fair enough. It's being facetious, you almost imagine Amenhotep II as a sort of a stereotypical or pantomime version of like JFK, sort of strutting around, that kind of personality.
Yeah, the fact he's a 6-footer in a world of 5'6" and that sort of thing. I think the fact he came to the throne at the age of 18, I think he would have been insufferable. And also, when you look at his records, he sort of celebrates the fact that he sort of killed people and hung them on the walls whereas his dad would never have done anything like that. So I think somebody who is recognizing he's got a father who he can never quite live up to, tries to outdo him in a way that his father would have been absolutely horrified at.
Fair enough. We could talk for much longer about all of that, so I will let you head off and begin your day properly. So, Professor Dodson, thank you very much for joining us once again to speak about ancient Egyptian history. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have indeed.
Very good. And in the future, please do keep us abreast of new publications as they come forth, because we'd love to have you back to talk about any and all figures that you are currently working on.
Great stuff. Okay, thank you very much.
Many thanks to Professor Dodson for joining the History of Egypt podcast. If you would like to learn more about these figures and the world in which they moved, Professor Dodson's new book, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, Pharaohs of Egypt, is now available at all good retailers. I'll put a link in the episode description directly to the publisher. Next week, our narrative resumes once more. Take care. I'll see you soon.